What if the future of the monarchy wasn't rewritten behind closed doors, but in a single sentence the world never expected to hear? That's where this story begins. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Not with a public ceremony, not with a gentle royal announcement, but with a decision so final, so cold, and so irreversible that even senior palace staff reportedly froze when they heard it. King Charles has confirmed Meghan Markle will never return as a working member of the royal family. Not temporarily. Not for now. Not until circumstances change. Never. And while the world was still trying to process the wording, the real shock wasn't the announcement itself. It was what it meant for Prince Harry. Because for years, no matter how complicated things became, Harry believed there was still a way back. A door left slightly open. A path to reconciliation. A future where time, healing, and quiet conversations behind the scenes might repair everything that fractured. Until now. So let's start at the moment everything shifted, not in the public eye, but in the silence before the storm. Have you ever noticed how sometimes the loudest moments in history are born from complete quiet? No leaked memo. No sudden press briefing. Just a subtle change in tone, so small that most people missed it. But the palace didn't. And neither did Harry. Because before the world heard a single word, something had already changed. And once that change happened, there was no going back, no matter how desperately Harry wanted one. So here's the question no one dared to ask out loud. What would drive a king, especially a father, to make a decision that permanently severs his own son's future inside the institution? Was it pressure? Was it strategy? Was it betrayal? Or was it something much darker? Something that forced the king into a corner he could never step out of? We don't have that answer yet, but by the end of this story, we will. Because there wasn't just one reason. There were layers, silent tensions, unseen warnings, moments that seemed harmless at the time, but now look like flashing red signals when you trace them backwards. And the most shocking part? This wasn't a spontaneous declaration. According to insiders, discussions about Meghan's future had been happening long before the public knew anything. And not even Harry realized how far those conversations had gone. Imagine believing you still had time. Imagine thinking reconciliation was difficult, but possible. Then imagine waking up and discovering the decision had already been made and announced to the world before you even knew it existed. That's the emotional earthquake Harry walked into. But here's where it gets even more unsettling. This wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as finality. Words chosen with surgical precision. Cold, uncompromising, designed to signal permanence without ever using the word itself. And that's where everything changes. Because when a royal statement removes hope, it removes the future attached to it. So why now? Why this moment? Why this level of finality, when the family has survived decades of scandals, conflict, and internal storms without shutting a door completely? That's the part no one saw coming. Not the public, not commentators, and definitely not Harry. Because behind the calm wording was something far more explosive. The realization that this wasn't just about Meghan's role. It was about what her return would mean for the monarchy going forward. Legacy, stability, reputation, control. For things the institution cannot risk losing again. But here's the twist. This decision didn't only protect the monarchy. It changed Harry's life forever. And he knew at the moment he heard the final line. Because when a door closes for one person, it closes for everyone attached to them. So if this announcement was only the beginning, what comes next? And more importantly, what did King Charles learn that forced him to make a decision even he can't undo now? We're just getting started. Because here's the part almost no one was prepared for. The announcement didn't just end a chapter. It rewrote the ending of a story Harry thought he still had time to fix. And if you think that sounds dramatic, wait until you hear what was happening in the weeks leading up to it. Let's slow down for a second. People often imagine royal decisions are made in grand rooms, under chandeliers, with signatures on heavy parchment. But the truth? The biggest shifts in the monarchy usually begin quietly. A meeting moved to an earlier time. A briefing shortened instead of expanded. A conversation that used to include someone, suddenly happening without them. Insiders say this was exactly that kind of moment. Not explosive, not loud, just a silence that felt different. The kind that makes everyone look at each other and ask, without speaking, did something just change? Imagine working inside the palace for years. knowing every rhythm, every schedule, every unspoken rule, and suddenly noticing that the atmosphere has shifted even though no one has said a word. That's how those closest to the situation reportedly knew something was coming long before the public did. But here's what makes this moment so unsettling. Harry didn't feel it. Or if he did, he didn't understand what it meant. Because while the palace was moving toward finality, Harry was moving toward hope. Think about that emotional collision. One side preparing for closure, the other preparing for repair. Two paths heading in opposite directions, destined to crash. And the most heartbreaking part? Only one side knew the crash was coming. Let's ask the audience something. Have you ever believed a relationship was healing, only to discover the other person had already made up their mind? That's what makes this story hit differently. Because despite everything, distance, interviews, books, headlines, Harry held on to one belief. Family doesn't close the door forever. Not as family. Not after everything they survived together. Not after decades of public storms that never resulted in a permanent exile. So when King Charles's decision was announced, clearly, publicly, and with zero room for misunderstanding, it didn't just surprise the world. It blindsided Harry. But here's where things take an even darker turn. This wasn't just a statement about Meghan not returning to royal duties. It was a signal about the future. A future without her inside the institution. A future with no role waiting. A future where the door wasn't simply closed, it was sealed. And whether people liked Meghan or not, whether they supported the couple or didn't, the emotional impact remains the same. A king chose permanent separation over possibility. That doesn't happen often in royal history. In fact, it's almost unheard of. So what made this situation different? Let's break down the possibilities carefully, and based only on what has been publicly discussed, speculated, or suggested by royal commentators and reporters. Because there are several theories. Not facts, just interpretations. Theory 1, stability. Some say the monarchy, after years of turbulence, couldn't afford uncertainty anymore. A return would reopen old wounds, invite new headlines, create confusion about roles, titles, expectations. Theory 2, timing. King Charles is in a phase of defining his reign. Every decision now sets the foundation for how history will remember him. Bringing Meghan back might have signaled weakness or indecision. Theory 3, trust. This one is the most whispered about, never officially confirmed. But according to some royal watchers, the palace may have reached a point where it no longer believed a working return would align with the institution's goals or stability. Again, these are theories, not declarations, not accusations, not established facts. Just the interpretations circulating in the public conversation. But no matter which explanation you believe, the outcome remains the same. The return is no longer an option. And that's when the emotional weight of this story hits full force. Because for Harry, this wasn't just about a royal role. It was about identity, belonging, history, legacy. Imagine being raised from childhood with one understanding of your future, then watching that future disappear not slowly, but instantly. People forget something important. Harry didn't just leave the family. He left the system that shaped his entire life. And while Meghan stepped into the monarchy as an adult, with a full identity outside it, Harry stepped out of the only identity he ever knew. So when the king declared the path shut forever, it didn't only affect Meghan. It rippled into Harry's core. And here's where the emotional tension becomes undeniable. What do you do when the life you left behind suddenly confirms it will never take you back? For some people, that brings relief. For others, devastation. For Harry, according to those close to him, it brought something far more complicated. Shock. Because even if reconciliation wasn't happening today, or next month, or next year, he believed one thing was still true. The option existed. Until the moment it didn't. But before we go further, we need to address one more critical detail that most people overlook. This announcement didn't come wrapped in anger. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't explosive. It was calm, measured, almost surgical in its delivery. And that's what makes it so powerful. When a statement is quiet, but final, that silence carries more weight than any confrontation. So let's ask another question. Why now? Why would a king decide to shut a door permanently at this exact moment? Not 2 years ago, not later, but now. There are three timing factors royal analysts have pointed out, and each one reveals something bigger happening under the surface. First, public reset. The monarchy, after recent challenges, is undergoing a reputation rebuild. Stability is the priority. Second, future planning. Every royal generation transition requires clarity. No blurred lines. No, maybe later. Roles must be defined before the next chapter begins. Third, private developments we don't yet know. Because the palace doesn't announce final decisions unless something internally forces a turning point. And that brings us to the question sitting quietly at the center of this story. What changed? What information reached King Charles that made him choose permanence over patience? Because something did. And the answer is not yet public. But we will get closer to it with each chapter of this story. For now, here's the only certainty. This was not a reactive decision. It was prepared, considered, discussed long before the world heard it. And once the announcement was made, the ripple effect began immediately, not outside the palace, but inside it. Because if Meghan's future was now finalized, the implications didn't stop there. There was another consequence no one expected, one that affects Harry directly. One that shifts not just the present, but the roadmap of everything that comes next. And that is where the story turns. Because while the world was focused on Meghan, the palace was already preparing for the next step involving Harry. But what that step is, and how far it goes, is something no one is ready to hear. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace had been silent for months, until one subtle move signaled a storm no one was ready for. That's where Chapter 1 begins. Not with headlines, not with interviews, not with Meghan or Harry making a public appearance, but with something so small, so easily missed, that most people scrolling past it never realized they were witnessing the first sign of an earthquake. Because before the announcement that Meghan would never return as a working royal, there was a shift, a quiet one. And silence, especially inside the monarchy, is never just silence. It's strategy. So let's go back. Not years, but just far enough to understand how the atmosphere changed long before the statement did. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly felt something was different, even though nothing was said? That's exactly how insiders described the palace during this period. Meetings felt shorter. Schedules were suddenly under review. Topics that once included Harry and Meghan weren't being discussed anymore, not even hypothetically. And here's the chilling part. No one announced the change. It simply happened. But if the shift was so subtle, what made people inside the palace realize something bigger was coming? It started with a single adjustment on the royal website. Not dramatic, not flashy, just one change, so quiet that it could have gone completely unnoticed. But in the world of the monarchy, wording is never accidental. Titles, positions, historical placements. They are updated only when necessary, and only when the future has already been decided behind the scenes. So when Meghan's profile stopped being referenced in the context of future engagements and instead shifted toward past contributions, palace observers noticed. Because language tells the truth long before a statement does. And if the website was evolving quietly, it meant conversations had already happened privately. Think about that for a moment. The public didn't know. Harry didn't know, but the institution did. Because the monarchy does not change anything forward-facing until the past has already been settled internally. And that was just the first sign. The second came from something even more subtle. A name removed from a draft. Royal correspondences often include placeholders, potential attendees for future events, expected participants, optional guest lists. Meghan's name, according to those familiar with planning, was not simply moved. It disappeared. Not postponed. Not marked TBD. It vanished. That's when those closest to royal operations realized this was no longer a temporary pause. It was preparation. So here's a question for you. Why would the palace start adjusting documents months before any announcement was made? Because the decision was already forming. And while the world was busy speculating about reconciliation, the institution was preparing for permanent separation. But the most heartbreaking part? Harry still believed the opposite. Sources close to him suggested he had been quietly optimistic, not because of public signals, but because of private conversations he hoped would eventually lead somewhere. Not instantly, not dramatically, just eventually. A gradual thaw, a softening, a possibility. But while Harry's hope was growing, something else in the palace was shrinking. Patience. Because inside the monarchy, time is not emotional, it is strategic. Every year of uncertainty creates instability. Every headline overshadows future planning. Every unresolved question becomes a risk. And the clock was ticking. So when King Charles reportedly held a private meeting with senior advisors, the tone shifted, not publicly, but internally. It wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. It was decisive. A simple question, according to those familiar with royal dynamics. What is the long-term plan? Not for the next month. Not for the next news cycle. For the next decade. And that's when the perspective changed. Until then, Meghan's potential return was an open possibility. Unlikely, maybe, but not closed. But once the monarchy shifted from reacting to planning, the equation changed completely. Because an institution built on continuity cannot operate on uncertainty. It needs clarity. Roles must be defined. Lines must be drawn. The future cannot stay vague, especially not in a reign that is already focused on legacy building. And that brings us to the turning point that no one outside the palace saw. Not even commentators, analysts, or reporters who track every royal movement like a chessboard. It wasn't a crisis. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a dramatic event. It was a realization. A simple one. A return would reopen everything the monarchy had spent years trying to stabilize. Not because of Meghan personally, but because of what her return would symbolize. A shift back into uncertainty. A revival of old tensions. A renewed media frenzy that the institution could no longer afford. So the palace made a decision, quietly first, then permanently. But before the decision was announced, something else happened that gave the internal shift away. A royal engagement list was released, featuring working members of the family. Harry and Meghan were not included. Not surprising. But here's what made it different. There was no wording implying that roles might change in the future. No phrasing like currently stepping back. No pending discussions. No open to reassessment. Just absence. Absence is never accidental in royal communications. It is a message without saying a word. So let's pause here and ask something directly. What's more painful, being told no, or realizing the no already happened without you knowing? That's the emotional impact at the center of this chapter. Because Harry wasn't just left out of the decision. He may have been left out of the process, not because of cruelty, but because the monarchy doesn't make decisions based on emotion, even when emotion is involved. And while observers began noticing these small signals, the world remained unaware. No headline picked up on it. No royal reporter broke the story. No commentator connected the dots. Because the palace wasn't ready, not yet. They needed silence. Silence to prepare. Silence to finalize. Silence to ensure that when the announcement came, it was irreversible. But then something unexpected happened. Something that confirmed the internal shift was not imagined, but real. A senior palace staff member, during an unrelated briefing, used a phrase that caught attention. The Duchess will not be returning to duties moving forward. Not at this time. Not as things currently stand. Moving forward. The phrase slipped only once, and never again. But the damage was done. Reporters heard it. Analysts replayed it. Screenshots circulated privately within journalist circles. Still, no one published anything, because with the monarchy, a single phrase is not enough. But inside the palace? It was confirmation that the internal decision was already locked. And from that moment on, the countdown began. No one knew when the announcement would come. Not the public, not the press, not even some members of the family. But those who recognized that phrase understood. This was no longer a discussion. It was a conclusion. And while all of this was unfolding, Harry remained unaware that time had already run out. But here's the detail that turns this quiet shift into something far more dramatic. The real trigger wasn't public. It was something King Charles discovered privately. And whatever it was, it changed everything. Because after that moment, the tone inside the palace didn't just shift. It hardened. Phone calls became shorter. Briefings became more controlled. Access became more limited. Something had happened that made the king move from consideration to decision. And that decision would soon become the announcement heard around the world. But before we get to that moment, the exact trigger, the private discovery, the detail that forced the king's hand, we need to follow the timeline to the next point in the story. Because the quiet phase was ending, and the irreversible phase was about to begin. What the king learned is the reason the door closed forever. And it's the reason the next chapter will reveal a truth no one was prepared for. Point 1. Confidential briefing changed the king's tone overnight, and insiders say it left him visibly shaken. That's where chapter 2 begins. Not with a public fallout, not with a family confrontation, but with information delivered behind closed doors. Information that, according to those familiar with the timing, shifted King Charles from hesitation to finality. So let's rewind to the moment before that briefing happened. Up until this point, the palace was operating in quiet transition mode. Not urgent, not rushed, just slowly distancing itself from the idea that Harry and Meghan could one day return. But then, something happened that accelerated everything. And here's what makes this moment so intriguing. It wasn't planned. It wasn't scheduled months in advance. It was arranged suddenly, reportedly within 24 hours. A private meeting between King Charles and a small group of senior advisors. Not the usual roster, not the wider circle, just the people brought in when a decision is no longer hypothetical, but necessary. And while no official record exists about what was discussed, the reaction spoke louder than any public statement ever could. Because the king walked into that meeting one way and walked out another. Let's pause and ask something. What kind of information changes a monarch's entire approach in a single conversation? Was it a warning? A risk assessment? A diplomatic concern? We don't know yet. But here's what we do know. Within hours of that briefing, changes began happening rapidly. And there was one sign that confirmed the shift wasn't temporary. It was definitive. King Charles canceled 2 follow-up discussions that had been planned with senior aides about future options. Future options, gone. Not postponed. Removed. Because once a king stops planning forward, it means the decision has already been made. But the most revealing detail wasn't the cancellation itself. It was how the palace responded immediately afterward. Communication tightened. Leaks disappeared. Briefings became shorter, more controlled, and stripped of anything interpretable. That only happens during one kind of moment inside the monarchy, when a pending decision becomes final. Think about the emotional weight of that. For years, the palace had been managing the Sussex situation reactively, responding, navigating, adjusting. But now, the response shifted from reaction to protection. Protection of what? Reputation? Stability? Legacy? Or something much deeper? Something not yet public? Because people assume institutions make decisions slowly. But sometimes, they move with startling speed. Especially when something forces their hand. So here's where this story gets even more unsettling. Sources say the tone of the room during that confidential briefing was somber, not angry. That matters. Anger drives punishment. Somberness drives inevitability. Which means this wasn't about retaliation. It was about conclusion. And yet, Harry still didn't know. Because while King Charles was absorbing whatever information was presented that day, Harry was living his life thousands of miles away, reportedly believing the relationship, though strained, was not beyond repair. Imagine that contrast. A father privately finalizing a decision. A son unaware that the window he hoped still existed was already closing. But that briefing didn't just change internal planning. It triggered a chain reaction. 3 things happened almost immediately after. First, advisors began drafting language for an eventual statement. Not yet finalized, but prepared. The monarchy does not draft statements unless they expect to use them. Second, certain royal households stopped referring to Meghan in future contexts. Not because of scheduling, because of strategy. And third, the most telling sign. King Charles requested updates on protocol related to permanent removal from working roles. That is not standard. That is not casual. That is preparation. But what exactly pushed the king to that point? Let's explore the possibilities, carefully, and only based on public speculation. Possibility 1. External pressure. Some analysts believe global advisors may have warned the monarchy that uncertainty surrounding Meghan's position could become destabilizing long-term. Possibility 2. Legal or diplomatic concerns. Not involving Meghan directly, but involving international partnerships that require clarity around representation. Possibility 3. Internal confidence. Meaning the monarchy realized reconciliation was no longer realistic, not emotionally, but structurally. Again, these are theories, not confirmed facts. But no matter which explanation fits, the impact remains the same. After that briefing, King Charles stopped looking at what could happen and started acting on what must happen. That shift is crucial, because once a decision moves from emotional to institutional, reversal becomes nearly impossible. And here's where the situation becomes almost tragic. Harry reportedly had no idea that the internal tone had changed, not because he was excluded maliciously, but because the monarchy only communicates decisions, never discussions. By the time Harry would hear the outcome, the conclusion would already be final. So ask yourself, what would it feel like to find out your future wasn't just uncertain, it had already been decided without your knowledge? That's the emotional core of this chapter. But there's something even more chilling. One detail from that confidential briefing spread quietly among senior staff. The king didn't respond immediately. He sat in silence, not debating, not arguing, just absorbing, because whatever he heard wasn't something he could ignore. It required action, permanent action, and within days, the palace entered what insiders described as containment mode. That's a rare phase. It only happens when the goal is not to prepare for negotiation, but to prepare for final messaging. Staff become tighter. Planning becomes controlled. Nothing leaks, which means the palace was no longer considering options. It was preparing for impact. But here's the part no one outside the palace saw coming. The confidential briefing did not only affect Meghan's future. It set off a second internal discussion, one that involved Harry directly. And what that discussion centered around is even more shocking than the announcement itself. Because while the world was focused on Meghan being permanently excluded, the palace was already considering what her exclusion meant for Harry's position. And that question leads us straight into the next chapter. Because the king's decision didn't stop at one door closing. It opened another, one that could reshape the royal family permanently. And the moment that second discussion began, everything changed again. What came next would not just shake Harry. It would redefine what the monarchy looks like for the next generation. Something shifted inside the palace after that confidential briefing, and the shift was unmistakable. Because within just a few days, people who normally operated with routine suddenly began behaving differently. Not dramatically, not obviously, but intentionally. Aides who once spoke freely became careful. Staff who normally floated between departments stayed confined to their own. Access, even for long-trusted employees, tightened without explanation. That only happens in one scenario, when the palace is preparing for a decision that cannot be walked back. And this is where the emotional tone of the entire situation changes. Up until now, the tension surrounding Harry and Meghan was viewed publicly as an ongoing issue. Unresolved, yes, but not final. But after the briefing, insiders say something chilling became clear. This was no longer an issue. It was an ending. And endings inside the monarchy do not come with warning labels. They arrive quietly, after the decision has already been sealed. So let's continue tracing what happened next. The king reportedly requested a private review, not of Meghan's past actions, but of future implications. That detail matters, because reviewing the past implies evaluation. Reviewing the future implies preparation. The question shifted from, should she return? To, what happens if she doesn't? Permanently. That single pivot changed everything. And here's another revealing moment. A scheduled communication strategy meeting, originally planned for the following month, was moved up unexpectedly. Not by a week, by nearly 3. Why? Because timing had become urgent. The palace needed alignment, not for something hypothetical, but for something imminent. And while that internal machinery was moving quickly, the outside world remained completely unaware. No headlines. No speculation, no leaked hints, silence. The kind that only appears when the institution is locking into position. Now, here comes the part that very few people know about. In the days following the confidential briefing, a senior aide reportedly began seeking clarity on historical precedent. Not recent history, older, cases involving permanent removal from future royal participation. There aren't many examples, and the few that exist were handled with extreme sensitivity, and in some cases, secrecy. So why would the palace suddenly need that information? Because the decision was moving out of discussion and into protocol. And protocol is the final step before action. Let's slow this moment down. Imagine being one of the few staff members who realize what's happening, not because someone tells you, but because the behavior around you changes. That's why insiders later described the palace climate as quiet, controlled, but undeniably tense. Tension without noise is the most dangerous kind, because it means the outcome is already known, even if it has not yet been spoken. But here's where the story becomes even more dramatic. While all of this was unfolding behind closed doors, Harry reportedly believed communication with his father was improving, not dramatically, but slowly. Short calls, polite messages, attempts at warmer tone. From Harry's perspective, things were getting better. From the palace's perspective, things were ending. Two completely different realities, heading toward the same collision point. And the saddest part? Harry didn't just misread the situation. He misread the timeline. Because by the time he believed there was progress was no longer even on the table. Let's ask the audience something directly. Have you ever tried to fix something that was already over, but no one told you? That's what makes this chapter painful. Because Harry wasn't in denial. He was simply late. And the monarchy wasn't being cruel. It was being final. But the question still remains. What exactly was said in that confidential briefing that pushed King Charles into certainty? We still don't know. But we do know what happened next. And it reveals how serious the situation had become. Within 2 weeks, the king reportedly made a private request. He wanted a comprehensive update on long-term succession optics. Not legal changes. Not immediate adjustments. Optics. Meaning, how Meghan's permanent absence would shape the monarchy's public image over the next 5, 10, and 20 years. That level of planning only occurs when a decision is not only final, but strategic. Because royal decisions are rarely about today. They are about history. Reputation is not measured in headlines. It's measured in decades. So if King Charles was already looking that far ahead, it means one thing. He was not considering reversal. He was preparing for legacy. Now, here comes the turning point most people don't know about. A second confidential discussion was scheduled, but this time, Meghan was not the primary topic. Harry was. And this is where the story shifts from tragic to devastating. Because the palace wasn't just deciding Meghan's future. It was deciding how her exclusion would affect Harry's role permanently. Think about the weight of that. For the first time, the institution was treating Harry's future separately from Meghan's presence. That separation is symbolic and historic. Up until now, every major decision involving Harry since leaving the UK was tied to the couple. But after the briefing, the monarchy began planning for Harry without Meghan. Not because they were separating, but because the institution had to prepare for a future where only one of them remained connected at any level. And that leads to the hardest question the palace had to confront. How do you define the future of a prince who no longer has a place inside the system, and never will? There was no easy answer. But the fact that the question was being asked at all shows how final the internal shift had become. And here's something even more significant. Sources say the king did not make this decision quickly. But once he made it, he did not revisit it. No hesitation. No reconsideration. No, maybe later. That is extremely rare. Because monarchs, especially fathers, leave room. Not this time. Why? Because something had made reconciliation impossible at the structural level, even if it were possible at the personal level. And that distinction is crucial. A family can heal privately. A monarchy cannot operate on hope. It operates on certainty. So while people assumed this was a personal rejection, it was actually an institutional one. And institutional decisions are the most permanent kind. But before the announcement could be delivered publicly, the palace needed to prepare for the fallout. Not from Meghan, and not from the public. From Harry. Because no matter how restrained he has been at times, a decision of this magnitude would feel like a breaking point. And the palace knew that. So the internal planning shifted once again, this time toward containment. How to deliver the message, how to frame it, how to absorb the response. And that brings us to the moment where everything was almost ready, but not yet in motion. A single step remained. One final development that would push the palace from preparation to action. Because as much as the confidential briefing changed the king's mindset, the next event changed the timeline. Something unexpected happened. Something the palace did not plan for. Something that forced their hand sooner than intended. And when that moment arrived, there was no turning back. The irreversible phase began. What happened next was the reason the announcement came earlier than anyone predicted, and why the king made a decision even he cannot undo. What comes in the next chapter will reveal the moment that accelerated everything, and the impact no one saw coming. The announcement wasn't supposed to happen this soon, but something forced King Charles's hand. That's where Chapter 3 begins. Up until this point, the palace was moving slowly, carefully, almost methodically toward a final decision. There was no rush, no deadline, no pressure to act immediately. But then, something happened that changed the pace overnight. What was originally expected to unfold months later suddenly became urgent. And the most shocking part? It didn't happen inside the palace. It happened outside, in the world the monarchy cannot control. Let's go back to the moment right before everything accelerated. King Charles had already shifted from consideration to conclusion. The internal groundwork was being laid. Advisors were preparing language. Protocols were being checked. But there was still time. The palace planned to wait. Maybe until the next major royal milestone. Maybe until the public climate felt appropriate. Maybe until the family could manage the emotional fallout quietly. That was the plan. But plans mean nothing when the outside world intervenes. Because one event, one unexpected development, changed everything. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a leak. It wasn't even something dramatic. It was something simpler, but far more dangerous to the monarchy. A narrative started forming without the palace's control. Rumors began circulating in certain media circles suggesting that Meghan might eventually return to royal duties someday, under the right conditions. Not confirmed. Not official. Not sourced. Just speculation. But speculation spreads faster than truth, especially when it involves the royal family. At first, it seemed harmless. Just another headline. Just another round of commentary. Just another recycled, what-if story. But then it escalated. Within days, the narrative shifted from possibility to assumption. Some commentators began framing Meghan's potential return as almost inevitable, as though reconciliation was already underway. And that's when the palace realized they had a problem. Because in the world of monarchy, perception becomes reality frighteningly fast. If the public begins to believe something is happening, the institution is forced into a corner. Either correct it, or let it define them. And this was not a rumor the palace could allow. Not because of personal feelings, but because allowing the world to believe Meghan might return created three major risks. Risk 1, uncertainty. The monarchy cannot function under speculation. It destabilizes planning and public trust. Risk 2, pressure. If the public expects reconciliation, any failure to deliver becomes a crisis, even if reconciliation was never on the table. Risk 3, precedent. A future return would imply that stepping away from royal duty is reversible, something the institution cannot afford to suggest. So suddenly, the decision that was supposed to be delivered when the time was right became a race against the clock. If they didn't act quickly, the narrative would calcify. And once the public locks into an idea, undoing it becomes nearly impossible. So the palace did something rare. They moved ahead of the story, not to punish, not to retaliate, but to reclaim control. Because if the public believed Meghan might return, then silence was no longer neutral. Silence became misleading. And the monarchy never let speculation rewrite their reality. But here's where things took an even sharper turn. Just as the palace was preparing to address the situation quietly, another development exploded across global media. Commentators began suggesting that King Charles had softened, that perhaps he was ready to welcome Harry and Meghan back into the fold. Not based on fact, not based on palace communication, based on pure interpretation of public appearances and edited headlines. Suddenly, the monarchy wasn't just dealing with speculation. They were dealing with expectation. And expectation is dangerous, because once the world believes a king is ready to open the door, closing it becomes twice as explosive. So the palace had a choice. Either allow the narrative to grow and let Harry and Meghan become symbols of a reunion that would never happen, or stop it immediately before it gathered momentum. They chose the latter. But here's the tragic twist. Harry reportedly didn't know this narrative was causing panic inside the palace. From his perspective, the speculation might have looked like a positive sign, a shift in public sentiment that could eventually help rebuild family ties. He could not have known it was doing the exact opposite. While the world saw possibility, the palace saw risk, and risk demands action. So within days, King Charles instructed advisors to accelerate the timeline. A statement would need to be made sooner than planned, not later, not after the next event, not after more internal discussion. Now, but here's something even more revealing. The statement did not begin as a public announcement. It began as a private one. Sources say the king intended to inform Harry personally before anything was released. Not out of obligation, out of respect, but something happened that complicated even that plan. The media frenzy intensified. Articles multiplied. Panels debated. Social media erupted. Hashtags appeared. Podcasts dissected every facial expression of every royal appearance. It was chaos, and the palace knows what chaos leads to. Loss of control. So the institution entered emergency messaging mode. The wording was revised. The delivery strategy was finalized. The window to inform Harry privately began closing rapidly. Because once the story reaches a certain velocity, silence becomes a statement in itself. The king no longer had the luxury of waiting. But this is where the emotional tragedy deepens. Harry was about to hear the most permanent decision of his life, not as part of a discussion, but as a conclusion. A conclusion that the world would hear almost simultaneously. And remember, from Harry's point of view, things were improving. He wasn't expecting closure. He was expecting time, which makes what happened next even more heartbreaking. Because before the palace could deliver the message privately, a leak occurred. Not the full decision, not the wording, just enough to confirm one thing. A major announcement involving Meghan was coming, and it wouldn't be positive. This leak didn't reach the public. It reached the press. And once journalists know something is coming, they begin hunting, calling sources, pressuring staff, tracking movements, pushing for confirmation. Suddenly, the palace didn't have weeks left. They barely had days. Every delay increased the risk that the story would break uncontrolled. And there is one rule the monarchy never violates. They announce major decisions on their terms, never under pressure. So the timeline shifted once again. The announcement was finalized, not softened, not delayed, not reconsidered, finalized. But even then, one more internal hurdle remained. The message needed approval from the king, not just in content, but in tone. And according to those who later heard the discussion, he made one specific instruction. The wording must not sound emotional. No anger, no blame, no personal undertones. It had to be calm, measured, permanent, without sounding punitive. That level of restraint tells us something critical. This was not a reaction. It was a boundary, a line drawn not from conflict, but from necessity. And that's where the chapter reaches its breaking point. Because while the world was days away from hearing the final decision, Harry still believed the door was open. He had no idea that the timeline had collapsed. No idea that speculation had triggered urgency. No idea that the monarchy was about to make a public declaration that would reshape his entire future. But the most devastating part? The king wasn't finished. Because closing the door on Meghan was only the first step. What the palace prepared next was even more shocking, and it involved Harry directly. The announcement was no longer just about one person. It was about what, or who, comes next. What comes in the next chapter will reveal how King Charles delivered the message, and why the way he delivered it was even more brutal than the message itself. It wasn't a statement. It was a symbolic execution. That's how insiders described Chapter 4. By the time the public heard King Charles's announcement, the groundwork had already been laid. But the impact wasn't just in the words. It was in the way those words were framed, the weight behind them, and the deliberate finality that left no room for negotiation or hope. This wasn't a casual pronouncement. This was a line in the sand, drawn with precision and authority, signaling that Meghan Markle's future as a working royal was permanently over. Let's rewind to the moments before the announcement. The palace had been preparing for weeks, aligning advisors, checking protocols, and rehearsing how the statement should be delivered. Every sentence, every clause, every word was scrutinized to ensure clarity and finality. In royal communications, phrasing is everything. Missteps can lead to misinterpretation, speculation, or worse, challenges to authority. And King Charles wanted absolute control over the narrative. Imagine being Harry at this time. Every ounce of his hope was still intact. He believed reconciliation might be possible. He imagined private conversations, subtle gestures, time to repair relationships. And yet, behind closed doors, the reality was already set. The reconciliation he longed for would never occur. The door he thought was slightly ajar had been shut and bolted from the inside. The symbolic nature of the announcement is what made it so devastating. Publicly, it was delivered in a calm, neutral tone, devoid of anger or sensationalism. But insiders note that the calmness was what made it so brutal. There was no chance for misinterpretation, no ambiguity, no softening language to give hope. Meghan was not being punished. She was being permanently excluded. The precision of that communication ensured that everyone, the public, the press, and Harry, understood the finality. But the symbolism went further. It wasn't just the words. It was the context. King Charles was asserting his authority not as a reactionary father or a protective monarch, but as the steward of a centuries-old institution. This was about legacy, stability, and control. The announcement conveyed a message beyond Meghan. It demonstrated that the monarchy's structure and order could not be challenged, even by someone once considered part of the inner circle. Here's a question for the audience. How would you process hearing that the future you thought was possible, a future you planned for, hoped for, and fought for, was permanently taken away? That's the emotional weight Harry faced. And insiders say he was stunned. Not angry, not defiant. Stunned. Because this was more than disappointment. It was an existential shock. The institution he grew up in had spoken, and the words were irreversible. The palace, of course, anticipated the fallout. Advisors carefully managed how the news would be circulated. The press release was timed for maximum clarity, avoiding speculation but ensuring the public grasped the finality. The symbolic execution wasn't about drama, it was about control. It was about delivering a decision that left no room for debate or reinterpretation. Yet, even with all this planning, the personal consequences were unavoidable. For Harry, the announcement wasn't merely a professional or public setback. It struck at his identity. He had spent decades preparing to serve, representing the family, and honoring the institution. And now, the future he envisioned, intertwined with Meghan and their potential public roles, was gone. Forever. The personal gravity of the situation was compounded by the public nature of the announcement. It wasn't delivered behind closed doors. It wasn't whispered. It was broadcast, analyzed, and dissected by every media outlet globally. The finality wasn't private. It was a public declaration that his family's decision had already been made, and that there would be no negotiation or compromise. But the announcement wasn't just a shock for Harry. Staff and advisors inside the palace were affected too. Some reportedly cried during debriefings. Others felt the weight of history, realizing that they were witnessing a rare moment in monarchy, a permanent exclusion that few could remember occurring without controversy. The emotional toll was undeniable, even for those who understood the necessity from an institutional perspective. And yet, as devastating as the announcement was, it was only part of the story. Because what happened immediately after, Meghan's private response, Harry's reaction, and the ripple effect across the family, revealed that the consequences went far beyond a single statement. The symbolic execution set the stage for an unraveling that would reach every corner of their lives, from personal relationships to public perception. One insider shared that the announcement left Harry silent for days. Not angry, not pleading, just silent. He reportedly spent hours reflecting, unable to reconcile the finality with his lifelong beliefs about family, loyalty, and the institution he was born into. And Meghan, thousands of miles away, faced her own reckoning. Realizing that her hopes for reintegration had been crushed before any dialogue could occur. Here's a surprising detail many missed. The announcement's tone was not only neutral but deliberate in its calmness. In previous royal conflicts, anger or drama often accompanied decisions. Here, the absence of emotion was more striking than any outburst could have been. It sent a clear, chilling message. This was not personal. This was structural. This was about legacy. And that's why the cliffhanger is so potent. Because while the world saw only the words, the palace knew the impact would reverberate for years. Harry, who had believed in reconciliation, suddenly faced an immutable truth. The door was closed. Permanently. And the next moves, both his and the monarchy's, would be defined by this irreversible moment. But what came next would shatter expectations even further. Because while Meghan's exclusion was final, the ripple effects weren't limited to her alone. Harry's response, the public fallout, and the internal dynamics of the royal family would push the story into uncharted territory. The previous chapters focused on preparation, internal tension, and the symbolic weight of the announcement. But now, the reality hit. Meghan Markle's future as a working royal was no longer hypothetical. It was definitive. Insiders say this moment wasn't about anger, punishment, or revenge. It was about clarity, structure, and setting a boundary that could never be blurred again. Think about it. The monarchy rarely closes doors permanently. It thrives on tradition, on continuity, on the careful weaving of public perception and private decision-making. Yet, in this case, the decision was unambiguous. Meghan would not return, ever. And that was communicated not just through words, but through the weight behind them, the institutional force of the monarchy itself. So how did this moment unfold? According to palace sources, a small circle of senior advisors convened shortly after the announcement to ensure the message reached Meghan accurately, without ambiguity. They understood that miscommunication could create chaos, and in the delicate realm of royal protocol, chaos is dangerous. The delivery was designed to convey the decision clearly. Meghan would not hold any future role in the working royal family. Permanently. Imagine receiving that message. Not as a public headline, not as a story to read on social media, but directly, officially, from the institution itself. It's one thing to hear speculation. It's another to hear that your official role has been erased. Not temporarily, but for good. And insiders say Meghan was reportedly shocked, even if she had braced herself for some form of rejection. This was final, structured, and coldly precise. And here's the key. The decision didn't exist in isolation. It wasn't merely about Meghan herself. It was about Harry, about the monarchy, and about the precedent it would set. By officially excluding Meghan, the monarchy signaled that no individual, no matter their popularity or influence, could alter the structure of the institution. Permanence over emotion. Legacy over personal relationships. But let's pause and consider the human side. Harry, thousands of miles away, reportedly had no knowledge of the precise content of this communication at the time. From his perspective, reconciliation still seemed plausible. There was hope, cautious but persistent, that perhaps discussions could reopen doors, maybe not immediately, but eventually. And yet, behind closed doors, the decision had already been finalized. Permanence was now the law of the land. Have you ever held on to hope, only to discover the opportunity you were clinging to had disappeared weeks or months earlier? That's the emotional magnitude Harry faced. But what made this moment even more striking wasn't just the permanence. It was how calculated the delivery was. The palace ensured that Meghan received the message in a manner that was factual, neutral, and void of personal emotion. There was no accusation, no blame, no hint of hostility. Instead, the clarity itself carried the emotional weight. This is final. There is no path forward. The effect on Meghan, insiders say, was immediate. Beyond the shock, there was a stark recognition of reality. Any hope of reintegration was gone. The door that had seemed slightly open was now closed, bolted, and reinforced with institutional authority. For someone who had previously engaged with the monarchy in both personal and professional capacities, this represented a seismic shift. Meanwhile, Harry's potential response added another layer of tension. The palace had anticipated that once news reached him, there would be significant emotional fallout. Advisors reportedly prepared briefings, guidance, and talking points to manage both public and private repercussions. But even with careful planning, the personal ramifications were unavoidable. Harry was tied to this decision as closely as Meghan. Permanence for her also meant emotional devastation for him. And the symbolism was intentional. Not only was Meghan formally excluded from any working royal role, but the messaging emphasized continuity, structure, and clarity. It was a reminder to the world, and to Harry, that the institution's priorities are not personal. Legacy, order, and stability outweigh individual desires. At this stage, the broader implications were already apparent. Analysts noted that this formal exclusion affected future engagements, public appearances, and even the planning of ceremonial events. Meghan would no longer be considered in succession-related functions or official duties. Her absence was institutional, not temporary. It would ripple through the monarchy for years. But perhaps the most impactful aspect was the emotional reverberation within Harry. The decision did more than close a professional door. It confirmed that a key element of his personal life, the hope for reconciliation with the family he grew up in, was now gone. Insiders describe him as shocked, silent, and deeply reflective. The reality was unavoidable. The permanence of the announcement had created a void he had not anticipated. And while the public would only see headlines and commentary, the private impact was far more profound. Staff who were aware of the communication noted a somber mood across the palace. Even those who understood the necessity of the decision couldn't help but feel the weight of history. Permanent exclusion of a prominent member of the family is rare, and the consequences, both personal and institutional, were immediately evident. But here's the twist: this was only the beginning. The permanent exclusion of Meghan Markle wasn't just a statement about her. It was a prelude to the next series of challenges. A ripple effect that would touch Harry directly, the public perception of the monarchy, and even the global narrative surrounding the royal family. And that leads to the cliffhanger that closes this chapter. While the public sees Meghan's exclusion, the palace knows that Harry's reaction, both emotional and strategic, will define the next stage. The door for him, though still open physically, is now psychologically fraught with finality. What Harry does next, and how the palace anticipates his reaction, is something no one outside the inner circle could have predicted. That's where Chapter 6 begins. After Meghan had received the formal notice of her permanent exclusion, the palace entered a critical phase: containment. What happens when a high-stakes, emotionally charged decision intersects with the global spotlight? In the royal family, the answer is careful strategy, disciplined communication, and, often, deliberate silence. For weeks, advisors monitored every ripple of information. The media was unpredictable, social commentary was rampant, and even minor speculation could ignite a wildfire. Insiders say that initially, some considered issuing a statement to clarify the decision publicly, to soften the narrative for Harry and Meghan. But after careful deliberation, they concluded, silence is stronger than words. Why silence? Because words, even well-chosen ones, can be misinterpreted. In a situation charged with emotion and historical significance, any statement could be spun to suggest weakness, indecision, or, worse, favoritism. Silence, by contrast, allows the decision itself to speak volumes. It is final, controlled, and impossible to misread. Inside the palace, this realization caused a shift. Teams that had been planning potential messaging, potential media outreach, and potential personal communications for Harry and Meghan were instructed to stop. Not postpone. Stop. Everything now revolved around waiting for the right moment to deliver the narrative carefully and without unintended consequences. Imagine the weight of that silence from Harry's perspective. In the weeks following the announcement, he reportedly reached out privately, expecting dialogue, updates, check-ins, or at least discussion. But there was none. The silence wasn't absence, it was deliberate. Every unanswered call, every deferred message, every delayed briefing compounded the psychological impact. The institution wasn't ignoring him. It was communicating finality without uttering a word. And here's the twist. Silence wasn't just a communication tool. It became a weapon of emotional clarity. For Harry, who had been clinging to hope for reconciliation, every day, without word, amplified the shock. The palace knew exactly how the human mind works in situations like this. Ambiguity can comfort temporarily, but prolonged silence forces confrontation with reality. Meanwhile, Meghan faced a different struggle. Though physically distant from the core of the palace, the permanence of her exclusion weighed heavily. She understood that the silence surrounding the announcement wasn't neglect, but strategy. Every report, every analysis, every piece of speculation that reached her reinforced one truth. The royal family had drawn a line she could not cross. And yet, for both Harry and Meghan, there was no public acknowledgement of their situation. Every day, they navigated the delicate balance between private grief and public discretion. That tension created emotional spikes that insiders described as intense, almost unbearable at times. The contrast between the silence of the palace and the scrutiny of the public created a dual reality, one where the decision's finality was amplified by the lack of communication. So let's ask a question. How do you cope when your future is permanently rewritten, but the world still treats it like speculation? That's the unique cruelty of this chapter. Harry and Meghan were experiencing both private devastation and public uncertainty simultaneously.